Hi.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Alembic. Always curious, are there any newbies? Has anybody ever been to the Alembic before? All right, welcome. Should be a really fun night. We like to do interesting psychedelic, cultural, historical programming here at the Alembic. Once a month, we do the Chalice, which is a sort of psychedelic salon emphasizing humanities, history, poetry, gods, conversations, elders, all sorts of fun stuff. And in a way, this weekend, we're actually having a lot of really dynamite programming. And I want to mention that before I introduce tonight's guest. It's kind of a psychedelic weekend here at the Alembic. Tomorrow, we have our great friend, Doc Kelly and crew from New York City. They run the Psychedelic Sangha, and they've been doing that for many years. And one of the many things Psychedelic Sangha does are bardo baths. And these are like sound baths with a twist. They're nice, mellow, but intense, immersive events with sound and light, and the extraordinary vibraphone playing of Chris Dingman, really remarkable player. So it's not just your usual bowls and gongs. We love bowls and gongs, but it's a little bit more juicy and transporting in some ways. Really, really remarkable. So they'll be doing 2 of these events. They're quite popular, one at 3 in the afternoon and one at 7 p.m. tomorrow. So definitely consider that. And then on Sunday from 10 to 4:30, we have Kat Harrison, who is a remarkable, wonderful entheogenic elder, brilliant ethnobotanist, poet, native California freak, goddess, brilliant person. We're so happy that she's doing events here. Tomorrow, I'm going to read the name of it because it's called Myth and Practice on the Serpentine Road. And she has a remarkable ability to weave in what you could call woo things, myth and poetry and animism, into very grounded, very gritty, very intense ways of understanding the mysteries of plants, of human life, of generations, of culture, of indigeneity, of being a white person lost and confused at the edge of the West. So she's really a remarkable teacher. And show up, she'll be talking about myth and this idea of the serpentine path. It was a sort of story she got at a certain point in her life, and it is about stories and snakes and how snakes snake their way through all of our stories and what kinds of stories they have to tell. So I really encourage you, if you want a nice dose of wisdom, check that out. And then on Sunday night, we have Misha Globerman. Misha Globerman. I have not been to one of these events, but people love them. It's called Tell Me Everything, Now Stop Talking. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm not going to say what it's about. No, what is it about, Katie? Can you give us a little drop? Because it's unusual.
I'll say it into the mic because the internet also needs to know. Hello, internet. Yeah, this is a thing. You guys know that Ken Wilber quote that at like a high enough level of development, any activity starts to seem spiritual. Misha is that for emceeing. He is the most amazing MC I've ever seen. He has this ability to kind of inhabit the consciousness of the crowd and the person on stage at the same time and like translate between them. So this event is called Tell Me Everything, Now Stop Talking. And the premise is we pull someone up from the audience, a volunteer. We don't just pull you if you don't want to come up, but we pull someone up from the audience and we have 12 minutes to fire questions at that person to get to know them as well as we can in those 12 minutes. And so anyone in the crowd can ask a question and Misha kind of catches the question, raises the stakes on it, and then gives it to the person. And once he demonstrates that 2 or 3 times, we break up into small groups of 4 and we try that with each other. The last time we did this, the post-event hangout went twice as long as the actual event because nobody wanted to stop talking to each other. So it's a really lovely way to spend a Sunday evening. If you're kind of like interested in meeting new people, but you don't want to stand around the water cooler and talk about how sports ball is going, this is like a nice way to do that. So that's on Sunday evening. And we set it up so that you can, in theory, go to Cat and then walk and get dinner and then come back and meet some new, different other weirdos on Sunday night.
All right, thank you. And now on to tonight's event. I'm really, really happy to have Sam Stern here. I invited him up from the wilds of Esalen, where he hosts the podcast, Voices of Esalen. And he also does remarkable work on the extraordinary archives that Esalen has. And even though the sort of spirit of Esalen and the human potential movement is often very much about the now, man, like just like being here now, the what there then is pretty fucking fascinating and like super influential. And people love to like make fun of Esalen. It's got a sort of cartoonish character in people's minds, but whatever else you want to say about it, they got down. I mean, it was like gnarly there. I remember one time I was at Esalen, and I met some old guard who had been there like in the late 60s, early 70s. And he was kind of a quiet guy. And I was like, and I'm, you know, I love history. I love this kind of stuff. And I'm like, what was it like, man? And he was like, it was scary. I was like, that's it. Anyway, so Sam he's going to have great archive stuff. He's a master of the lore. He teaches this stuff at Esalen, which is really great because, you know, well, just to make another just a comment about Esalen is it's part of our DNA here. Michael Murphy, one of the co-founders, has a famous phrase that, or sort of a mantra almost, that no one captures the flag. And that means that there's not a dominant way of saying what the truth is or who's got the truth. And that can make for messy organizational problems. It can make for some incoherence and some razzle-dazzle conflicts sometimes, but it's a much healthier position to take than the guru route. He was very much post-guru. The place is trying to experiment with that. And that's something that we're really trying to do here, where we're showing a multiplicity of perspectives and practices. We want people to find their own way through things. We recognize that it's not necessarily the easiest or clearest way to illuminate the path, but it's a way that works for us. So it's really, I feel like hearing this Sam's presentation, I was also hearing about the current that we're in and that we're also trying to perpetuate. So he teaches this stuff there. He also teaches a course on AI and creativity, which sounds very interesting. And so after he'll do a presentation for around an hour. We'll take a very short break, and then we'll come up and he and I will have a conversation, and we can take questions then, because I'm sure there will be questions. So with no further ado, Sam, thanks for being here.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you all so much for having me. Yeah, this is great. Thanks for the intro from the priest of high weirdness, Erik Davis. And I was trying to remember how we met, and I think I reached out to you in the summer of 2020 to try to get you on Voices of Esalen, and you were like, just wait a little while, bro. Maybe in a couple of years. So maybe next week I'm going to get Erik for the first time. This picture up here that I've had up for a little while is there's a QR code on there. If you take a picture of it, it'll show you some of the programs that are happening at Esalen this summer and this fall. In about a week, there's this incredible all campus-wide program called Summer Groove, where my colleague Sadia Bruce has brought an incredible host of musicians there, and it's going to be a real good time. And in the fall, we have something called the Altered States of Consciousness, which is another like campus-wide program where they'll be exploring issues like this, but it won't be history. It'll be like the now. So yeah, that's something kind of cool to think about. The other thing I want to presence before I get into this Altered States history at Esalen is just the history of the Esalen check-in. For people who haven't heard of it or haven't been to Esalen, I'm just curious, who has been to Esalen here? So 99% of the people here. Yeah, there's this tradition at Esalen of saying like, how are you, in this moment? What's going on for you? Who are you? What's crucial for you? That kind of thing. Often when I teach at Esalen, I get the chance to go around the room and I get to hear from people like who you are, what's going on. Because of the size of the room and the time limitations, there's not as much of that. But maybe later when the Q&A comes around, maybe people, before asking their questions, hi Mary, could Mary's a colleague at Esalen, could presence like, how are you right now in this moment? It's just a thought, but it's a very Esalen type of thing. So with no further ado, a very brief history of altered states at Esalen. And I will forget things. There are so much altered states has transpired at Esalen in Big Sur that I'm sure to have omitted something here. So this is a brief version. So this is Esalen in 64 or 65. It was It was Esalen in name, but it took a little while for that name to be reflected on the big wooden sign that greets you as you drive down the hill. It was Big Sur Hot Springs in 64, 65. And here's a picture of one of the founders, Michael Murphy, who is alive. He's 93 years old. He's still with us, and he's very much in compos mentis. If you see him at Esalen, you can talk to him. He's very enthusiastic, and he's always down to just hear about you and meet you. So he looks a little bit different than there. And here's Dick Price. He's the other founder. Dick is not with us. He passed away in the mid-1980s, and the story was that he passed away in the canyon at Esalen while he was hiking. So these two men are very much intellectuals, and they were very much sort of out of the mainstream as well. Both of them went to Stanford. In 1950, they entered Stanford, and by 51 or 52, both of them were gone. So what happened with Michael is that he had an awakening of sorts when he was in a philosophy class, and he was sort of on track to be president of his fraternity and such. And after that awakening, he left Stanford and he ended up going to India. He took up meditation very seriously. He was meditating 8 hours a day. He went to the Sri Aurobindo ashram in India, for those who have gone to Oroville. I think that is sort of the modern name for it. And he just was out of the mainstream. Now, Dick Price had a different story of sort of an altered state of consciousness. After he left Stanford, he went to the Air Force. And while he was in the Air Force, he had a psychotic break. So the Air Force in the United States in the 1950s is not the best place to have a psychotic break. Now, Dick's father was very much connected with people at the high levels of government. He was the vice president of Sears Roebuck, and he was able to arrange for an honorable discharge for Dick, but it was on the sort of condition that he would have to go to a mental hospital. So he went to a posh mental hospital in Chicago called the Institute for the Living. And while he was there, as was very much sort of the fashion at the time, he was made to undergo a lot of insulin shock therapy treatments. Over the course of 1 year, he endured over 60 insulin shock therapy treatments, which left him really a shell of himself. And it left him with this profound distrust in the state of modern psychiatry, which would prove to be very important for the founding of Esalen in the early 1960s. So another figure that I want to presence here too, that would sort of bound and base the early Esalen was Aldous Huxley. So a lot of people know Huxley for Doors of Perception, obviously, which is one of the first kind of cogent accounts of the psychedelic experience of mescaline in the West. And I think that was written in 54 or 55. But what a lot of people don't know is by the end of the 1950s, Huxley was actually living in the Bay Area. He had moved here. And he was speaking not only about psychedelics, but he was speaking about this thing that he was calling human potentialities. And Huxley was very interested in education. And he felt that education had failed in the West. It was very good at instilling sort of, geography, spelling, mathematics, what have you. But it was not as interested in exploring the nether regions, the ones that are harder to quantify, but are no less important for the development of individuals. And so he was envisioning in the talks that he was giving in the Bay Area at that time, a center that could be dedicated for the exploration of sort of the outer reaches. And Michael and Dick, as chance would have it, both heard Huxley, and Michael reached out to Huxley, and he was able to forge a kind of friendship with him. And Huxley became an early mentor, and he ended up giving Michael his first hit of LSD, which Michael took with Laura Huxley. So Laura Huxley guided him through the bardos of LSD. And as Michael recounted it to me, he didn't do psychedelics that much. That wasn't his particular medicine. He was able to go to much farther places through meditation, which he pursued so seriously. But he did have good company in terms of the handful of experiences that he had, some of the stars of the psychedelic set. So I want to walk you through quickly some of the early catalog offerings that came from Esalen in the 1960s, just to show sort of how deeply ensconced the psychedelics, the interest in psychedelics was for the early leaders of Esalen. And this offering, Drug-Induced Mysticism, led by none other than Myron Stolaroff, So for those of you who have read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which came out in 2018, it's an excellent primer of sort of the history of psychedelics in the West. You'll recognize that name, Stolaroff. But this is from the very first weekend of Esalen's offering, from the fall of 1962. This course happened. So yeah, it was just interesting that Stolaroff, who worked at Ampex as a recording engineer, and he was instrumental in developing the first reel-to-reel for consumers, he was dosed in the 1950s. And as happened for a lot of people who underwent the psychedelic experience, he became sort of an evangelist for the drug. He really saw great potential in it. So he left Ampex and he dedicated himself to creating the International Foundation for Advanced Study, where he brought people in Menlo Park, about 350 people over the course of several years, through the LSD experience. This is from the next year, from 1963, a post-psychedelic seminar. So the idea that people would come to Esalen not to take psychedelics, but to unpack the meaning of psychedelics. And I still think that this sort of intention holds a lot of promise for Esalen as a place where people can be brought together. Maybe it's a little bit like the Alembic, in the sense that a community is sometimes necessary to sort of unpack these enormous experiences that blow one's mind. Because without the unpacking, it becomes sort of like a cloistered or unexamined thing. So it was interesting to see that even at that early stage in 1963, when not that many people, it's barely hippies had begun to take LSD. I mean, the word hippie probably wasn't even born then. It was mostly a drug, if I'm not mistaken, that was used within the therapeutic context. But those people were coming to Esalen, and it was important for them to discuss and try to understand. This is from a little bit later during the 1960s. And the reason that I bring this up, I think it's 66 or 67, is that name Leo Zeff. So Zeff, is one of sort of the godfathers of psychedelic psychotherapy. And throughout the 1960s, he was bringing people through the LSD experience. And the way that I've heard it told is that by about mid-1970s, Zeff was ready to retire from the game. And it was just about that time that the legendary chemist Sasha Shulgin synthesized MDMA. And somebody brought that to Zeff, and he realized the potential that it had for psychedelic psychotherapy. And so he stayed in that profession for much longer in the underground and trained a generation of therapists. But it's interesting to see that he was brought there again in 67 at Esalen. This catalog offering, and pardon this weird AI-generated drawing of Charles Tart that I created just yesterday. Yeah, I'm always combing through the Esalen catalogs. It's incredible because I never really finish. I go through and I find something amazing, and then it's really time to go back in and find something else. So I'm just combing through there. What could be useful, again, in the history of altered states at Esalen? And there's Tart. So he did a course in 1971, a completely systematic sort of analysis of cannabis, of marijuana. So I think it's really interesting. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that 71 lecture. And this too, I bring this up because Lee Sinella, right? He was an interesting person. He ended up creating a Kundalini center in the Bay Area. But at this 1972 offering, was it? I can't quite remember. Maybe it's late 60s, maybe it's early 70s. But Sinella has developed his own technique for the rapid and controlled evocation of altered states of consciousness using methylphenidate and CO2 gas. So things were probably getting a little bit wild. I had to look that one up to see exactly what that was like. And then his partner in crime there is a legendary hypnotherapist. So at the Esalen of the late 60s, it was quite experimental, right? They were throwing spaghetti against the wall and trying to see what sticks. I also want to show just a couple more slides to intimate the importance of the counterculture at Esalen. Around 64, around 65, you start to see things in the catalog that are seeping in that show that reflect what's going on in culture outside. So this is from fall of 64, Ken Kesey. So for folks who have read The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, that book comes out in 68, but it actually details the adventures that Kesey and his gang had in riding across America, Kesey being the Johnny Appleseed of LSD, the Merry Pranksters and the Dayglow Bus, all of that happened in summer of 64. So by the fall of 64, Kesey's back at Esalen and he's teaching for a week. This is also from 64. So Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary. And Leary and Alpert at this point are a couple of years removed from the Harvard psilocybin project. I think that's the name of it. And so it was around 61 or 60 when it was the first large sort of media kerfuffle organized around psychedelics where Alpert and Leary had given psychedelic mushrooms to willing graduate students, and it became, a big scandal, and they were both summarily dismissed. By 64, they were living in an enormous mansion in Millbrook, New York, and attempting to start their own religion, which I believe was called the League for Spiritual Discovery. They had the idea at that time that they were able to escape prosecution by beginning their own religion. And at that time, interestingly enough, G. Gordon Liddy, who later would become famous for the Watergate break-ins, was a DA in New York who was pursuing them quite avidly. But October 30th to November 6th, they were at Esalen and giving LSD to Michael Murphy. In this next little video clip, I want to show you a snippet from an interview that I did with the former chairman of Esalen's board, Jeff Kripal. And in it, he speaks about the engagement that Esalen had with the counterculture during the first decade of its existence.
There was a kind of serendipity here. There was a kind of massive synchronicity between what Mike and Dick wanted to do and what the culture was ready for. An idea is an idea that's waiting for the right cultural or social moment. And what you have to understand about early Esalen is that none of the ideas were new. The ideas had been floating in the culture and in these writers' lives for sometimes decades, but nobody was listening. And in the early 60s, you then have this youth culture that suddenly is listening, and it's this magical alchemy that creates this movement. It really becomes famous. It becomes one of the nodes of this counterculture, and it's where you want to go. So George Harrison lands here with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi on the front lawn in a helicopter. I mean, so it's got cultural cachet. Esalen certainly did not produce the counterculture by any stretch of the imagination, but it happened to get going right as that was happening. And then they become synergistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really key, I think, in that, Esalen didn't produce the counterculture in any way. It's more like the counterculture swayed Esalen, and its geographical location was almost as important as the time that it came into being. It's situated right there in Big Sur, in between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and they're very close by is La Honda, where Kesey is situated. And for folks who wanted to both be part of a scene that was being created at that time, but also sort of escape the Sunset Strip or the Haight-Ashbury, Esalen Institute was sort of this for a very fine moment, right? This incredible place to be. Not that it's still not incredible, it absolutely is, but there was this very interesting synchronicity and synergistic quality that was happening at that time. And I think for folks who have engaged in the psychedelic experience, synchronicity is this element that comes out, and plays very, very boldly. There was a piece in that clip for folks out there that said Celebration at Big Sur. And if you go on YouTube and you search Celebration at Big Sur, there's an 1.5-hour documentary that details the Big Sur Folk Festival of 1969. And Crosby, Stills and Nash are there, Joni Mitchell, Chambers, sisters. Yeah, there's a lot of incredible artists, and it's a fun watch. And I just want to show you this next clip to sort of illustrate the ways that mainstream America sort of was dealing with the idea of altered states. So this clip is from Dragnet and from 1966, I think.
Have you been smoking marijuana?
Marijuana is illegal, I know that.
That's right.
For now. In a couple of years, things may change when all the kids grow up and start wearing ties and going to the polls. Marijuana is going to be like liquor, packaged and taxed and sold right off the shelf.
I doubt it, Mr. Shipley.
Look, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it seems to me there must be better things for cops to do than chase down wild rumors about something as innocent as marijuana. Why don't you go after the big bad guys, the heroin peddlers? I won't argue with you about them. They should be stopped.
That's right. We'd like to put them out of business. That's why we're here.
What do you mean?
We're trying to keep them from getting a new customer.
There's a big difference between marijuana and hard narcotics.
Yeah, but it's only a small step.
And everybody who takes a drink is going to be an alcoholic. We know that's not true, don't we? Let's face it, we're on opposite sides of the fence and there's nothing we can do about it. For you, if there's a law against it, it's wrong, black and white. I just don't see things that way, that's all.
Well, you ought to give it a try, fella. It might keep you out of jail.
How about that voice? Like, that's amazing. I was pretty impressed actually by sort of the fair-mindedness and sort of even-handedness of that show. And I wish that I knew the exact date of it, because it feels like there was this moment in the media in the 1960s, or not a moment, a long period where they were very much behind psychedelics. They were into it, and then it changes, and it changes quickly. It changes almost overnight. And by 1966, Life magazine is coming out with like the exploding mind threat that got out of control, and you're starting to see things in the New York Times headlines that detail genetic damage linked to LSD. Banana smoking be understudy and all that, and things change quite quickly. I want to make sort of a leap here, a conceptual leap, in that I want to kind of try to propose the point that altered states of consciousness at Esalen were varied, and not all of them involved plant medicines. People in the 1960s flocked to Esalen to partake in some of the practices of humanistic psychology. In the 50s, early 60s, psychology is dominated by two major trends, and one of those is psychoanalysis. The other one is behaviorism. And both of those disciplines were quite revolutionary in their time, but they were also rigid in their own way, and they're also hierarchical. And so by the time that the early 60s are coming around, people are questioning everything, and they want to engage in different ways of exploring themselves. So this guy, Fritz Perls, is sort of the godfather of Gestalt. And Gestalt is that presence-based awareness practice that became a group psychological practice at Esalen that people were very much drawn to. And he doesn't look charismatic nor magnetic in any way, but apparently he very much was a drawing card to Esalen. So this next clip I want to show you is from an Adam Curtis documentary. Adam Curtis is a fantastic documentarian. This is called The Century of the Self, and it sort of goes into Fritz Perls and Gestalt at Esalen during the mid-1960s.
Their center was a tiny old motel on the remote coast of California. It was called the Esalen Institute. The dominant figure at Esalen was a psychoanalyst called Fritz Perls. Perls had been trained by Reich and had developed a form of group encounter in which he pushed individuals to publicly express the feelings inside them that society had said were dangerous and should be repressed.
It's a basic fear of that thing inside me, like a little demon in there. It doesn't come out very often.
Now put the thing inside you on that chair, talk to it.
Perls used to call this getting on the hot seat in front of a group. If this were the hot seat and you were Perls, and you would guide me into this process of self-enactment, self-revelation, staying present to all the parts of yourself and noticing it, and then taking ownership of this.
Yes, I can come out. I can come right out of him, and I can push him aside. I can make you all cry. There isn't one of you that I would spare. Not even you.
Yeah. How do you feel now?
I feel better. I feel very honest.
Yeah.
I'm frightening. When I have my power, I'm frightening.
See, I frighten you with my power.
I frighten you with my power.
Now, where do you feel your power? In your hands? In your muscles? Where else?
Wake up!
Okay. Stop it.
You. It was not phony movement. That's what I wanted to do, and I did it.
What Pearls and others working at Esalen believed was that they were creating ways that allowed individuals to express their true inner selves.
I want them to applaud for me.
Out of this, they believed, would come new autonomous beings free of social conditioning.
Oh my God, it's so touching. It really, every time I watch that clip, I get so touched by that woman who said, I want them to applaud for me. There's something like really special about that. And this idea of the unfolding of the self, of self-revelation and self-enactment happening was not new at Esalen. That kind of self-enactment had been happening in the area of the therapist for a long time, but it happening in sort of a semi-public forum amongst the group, that was new, and people were animated by that. I think to talk about the 1960s, it's important to sort of also speak about the 1950s, which was an era that was so characterized by conformity, by repression of the self. And in the 1960s, which just happens to be the sort of the genesis of Esalen, all of that is beginning to be challenged and cracked open by a variety of methods, amongst them psychedelics. But there's this draw to have the electrifying sensation of being seen, right? And people were very much animated by that. And so the cousin to Gestalt, or sort of Gestalt 2.0, would be the encounter groups. And this is sort of a picture of folks who are engaging in some elements of an encounter group at Esalen in the late 1960s. To talk about encounter, I'm going to show another clip which will very much illustrate what encounter is. But the way that I think about it is that with Gestalt, it's done in group, but there's a ringleader there. Fritz is very much the director. He was somebody who came out of theater, actually. He had a theater background. And he was interested in controlling the moment. And it's basically the person who is on the hot seat, who gets the energy of the group. With encounter groups, it is more anarchic. It's less hierarchical. Anything can happen, and anything often did happen. And it was controlled not only by the group leader, but it was controlled by anybody who wanted to speak out. It's maybe, a predecessor to the 12-step meeting in certain ways. So Will Schutz was the most popular and famous leader at the time. So this next clip, there's his bald head, I think, at the top of that image. But this next clip that I'm going to show shows a documentary that was made at Esalen in 1969 or 1970 called Here Comes Everybody. And it's based on the work of William Schutz.
Sit in front of the person, look him in the eye, touch him in whatever way you like, and tell him exactly how you feel about him.
I'm not sure how much is true and how much is an act. Like, I get the idea that so much of you is just an act. Like even when we were walking around feeling each other's faces, that you were just sort of inside sort of laughing.
You're cold, you're dead looking, you're dead acting. You come on to me with this cool facade. I don't believe. I think you're scared shit of me easily.
Hey, something bothers me about you. A lot of people have said things to you, and you're always like, you make a statement, and then you retract it by saying, I don't think. I asked you a question about what I imagined. She said something, somebody before, and so he's like, oh, I'm not doing this, I don't think. And it's like,
yeah,
I get a very wishy-washy feeling about, like...
I don't blame him. What I'd like you to do is look each other right in the eye and hit this as hard as you can and keep going and scream at each other as you do it. As hard as you can. Keep it as long as you can.
I've done it so much. I'm just sort of...
I've never seen you.
No, I've done it inside. I've never done it,
Do it for me.
hitting a wall or anything.
Do it for me.
There you go.
Feels like there's a lot to say about that. But it's like, again, if you look at the catalogs from Esalen from about 65 till about early 1970s, about 20% of the offerings are some form of encounter groups. These were, I think, enormously popular, for sure, enormously entertaining. You know, maybe that was part of it. And they're confrontational. Again, there's this idea, and I chatted with Erik about this a while back. So I want to hear later when we talk what Erik's thoughts are on this. But there's this idea about breaking down the cage of the self in order to let this new self kind of come through. But the interesting thing about this is, like, there's the other people in the room who are saying, "I'll help you. I'll break it down for you." You know, and so for some of the people who I've spoken to who took part in the encounter groups of the 60s and 1970s have told me that the scars are still there from some of the things are enormously hurtful that people would say. And there was this idea of radical responsibility, I think, that was put forward at that time, sort of like, you can't make me feel like anything. And then at the same time, I'm responsible for myself. And I just think that it's more complicated than that. And we have a more nuanced view these days. And we also live in a much more litigious society where none of this, sit down in front of the people, touch them in any way you want. I don't think that's going to work. But at the time, and again, super popular. And there were all of these interesting splinter groups that went on. So for example, marathon encounter was a thing. So encounter, but for 24 hours or 48 hours, and nobody leaves the room and nobody sleeps. There was nude encounter. This guy, Paul Bindrum, I don't think that he taught at Esalen a lot, but I know that he taught at least once because I found this in the 68 catalog. So Bindrum's idea was that encounter is great, but nude encounter, even better. And if you can get it to happen in water, then you're all good. And apparently there's the documentary floating around somewhere about Paul Bindrum that I've been unable to locate. But if anybody finds it, you have to tell me. Talk to me after. And then there was encounter for couples. And this had its own set of pitfalls.
Will and I used to lead couples groups together, and I'm afraid I may have caused some divorces. As I said, we were always going for the energy. And I came up with the idea, well, tell your 3 worst secrets. And in encounter groups, that worked pretty well. People just would really dig up stuff. That stuff they'd never said out loud in their life and never expected to. And then they'd say it out loud, and it would be a healing thing, it seemed. But when we did it in couples groups, people were like admitting to affairs they'd had, and then that led to divorce. So if anybody out there, if I ruined your marriage, I'm sorry.
Rough, but of course there was a class for that. Shift gears again. It's impossible to talk about the history of altered states at Esalen without talking about and honoring Stan Grof. So Stan Grof, he, for those who don't know, he was sort of, I've used this word godfather so many times tonight, I'm sorry, but to say it, but he was godfather of psychedelic psychotherapy. He might be the person in the world who led the most people through the LSD experience. And he was doing this in Czech Republic. And he taught at Esalen a couple of times before he came to live in the United States. He was, this is from a 66 catalog. But in about, I think it was 68, he left Czech Republic and he came to work at Johns Hopkins. And he was involved in what became the last funded LSD research kind of what's the word, experiment or foundation before, what's that? Yes, exactly. Before the money ran out, because in 68, Nixon was elected. And one of the first things that he did was form the DEA. So by 1970, LSD had been made a Schedule I substance. And Schedule I meaning there was no therapeutic value for it and that it had a high possibility for addiction. So he went to a party and he met Michael Murphy, and Michael Murphy invited him to come to Esalen, and Stan ends up staying there. There's his wife, Christina. They end up living there for 14 years. And while he was at Esalen, he became sort of an enormous center of gravity. And he invited all sorts of intellectuals. He was a very great curator of minds. And of course, another important thing that he did at Esalen in the 70s, he was speaking about LSD so many times that people would be, very into his lectures, and apparently they would sidle up to him after the lectures and being like, well, I liked what you were talking about, and do you have some LSD that I can try? And of course, at that time, LSD was very illegal. So he wasn't able to supply that. And over the course of a couple of years, during the 1970s, he was able to develop holotropic breathwork. And holotropic breathwork was the type of altered state of consciousness that, incredibly enough, one could slip into simply by the technology of their own body, by engaging in breathing. And Grof developed this practice that is still very, very much with us today, and people are beginning to engage in, I think, in a really mainstream way. So it's very interesting. Another piece of this puzzle that I want to just mention very briefly that Grof was involved in. There's Grof, there's John Perry, I believe, there's Claudio Naranjo, and that is Julian Silverman. And the folks in this room in late 1960s had gotten together to discuss a program that they instituted at Agnew State Hospital in California, which was essentially a way to attempt to treat schizophrenia without any medication. And Dick Price was, again, kind of coming back to the psychotic break that he suffered. Price didn't just suffer that one psychotic break in the Air Force in the 1950s. It happened a couple of other times to him. And it became sort of a passion of his to look at that state that some were calling psychosis as sort of an altered state of consciousness that could be useful for that person. So they were able to develop this program, the first of its kind at Agnew State Hospital, where folks could attempt to deal with what society was calling a psychotic state in a different way. And it went on for several years. Another character who I think is impossible to talk about the history of altered states at Esalen without, you can't leave this guy out. It's John Lilly. So Lilly here was offering the personal super biocomputer and psychedelics. Lilly was famous for three things, basically. He was an enthusiast of the idea of interspecies communication, which is humans and dolphins specifically being able to speak the same language. And he was an early experimenter with ketamine. He was many, many years ahead of the pack. And unfortunately, it ended up driving him quite insane. He really indulged in that substance, and he became a different person by the end of the 1970s and early 1980s. And he also developed the world's first sensory deprivation tank.
Dr. Lilly invented the sensory deprivation tank in 1954 using a modified diving mask. Dark, silent, and floating in salt water heated to body temperature to simulate the feeling of weightlessness. He discovered the means of accessing a psychedelic state which would become the forefront of his curiosities.
Interesting. Yes. So, yeah, he's definitely on the wackier side, but it got way wackier from there. And by the way, that last video comes from a very compelling YouTube documentary that I found called The House of the Dolphin. And it speaks about Lilly's interest in getting to know dolphins and going deeper with another species than one would have thought possible. And he meets this 23-year-old woman named Margaret Howe, who had the same passion.
Margaret's job was to teach Peter English just like a mother would a child.
Hello, Margaret. Nice.
Dr. Lilly, who'd agreed not to interfere, would be floating in the darkness of his sensory deprivation tank above them, assisting Margaret not physically but telepathically.
Yes. And if you know a little bit more about the Lilly story, then you'll know that Lilly ended up injecting Peter with LSD, and things didn't go too well from that point. It was sort of a failed experiment, and that there was some intricacy, I'll just leave it at that, with Margaret and the dolphin, but it became sort of a love story. Esalen was the place, where people could come. And, by the time that the 80s roll around, it had its own reputation. And people wanted to be there just sort of because it was Esalen, and it attracted all sorts of people. And one of them was the Nobel laureate, Richard Feynman.
The problem is not what might be wrong, but what might be substituted precisely in place of it. As soon as any real, definite idea is substituted, it becomes almost immediately apparent that it doesn't work.
So Feynman is this fast-talking genius physicist whose his work is sort of bookended by two main events of his life. And one was that, as you saw, as a younger man, he worked on the Manhattan Project. And as a slightly older man, in the 1980s, he was part of the task force that investigated why the Space Shuttle Challenger ended up exploding. But in the early 1980s, he ended up going to Esalen. And while he was at Esalen, he made the acquaintance of what he called the three graces, some of which are here in the audience tonight. We have Cheryl Haley, Debbie Harlow, and the other Grace. I don't see Barbara Berg, but she was amongst them. And these women were very interested in bringing Feynman through the psychedelic experience. And he too was interested. To that point, he had avoided psychedelics because he was afraid of what it might do to his mind. But nearing the end of his life, and he had a cancer diagnosis, so that might have played into it. Near the end of his life, he felt more interested in exploring it. And the Feynman was the subject, and the three graces were a subject of a 4-part arc on the Freakonomics podcast. So if you're interested in learning more, definitely go into that. But I was able to meet Stephen Dubner and hear more about Feynman's journey at that time.
I remember recalling one of the LSD session. I thought it was so funny. He was lying on the same couch staring at a banana for 3 hours, quiet as could be. He would just turn it once in a while. And afterwards I asked him what was happening. He said, very sincerely said, I don't know, I was just looking at the banana.
It was like, pow. Tears were pouring down his face. And I could tell he was in ecstasy. He was just laid back and he was bliss, and eventually opened his eyes and he said, oh, Debbie, he said, it's even more beautiful than you promised.
Never going to change how they do arithmetic to make it more like humans. That would be going backwards. I'll tell you, I'll make it easy for you. Just give me the numbers back the way I gave them to you. You ready? 1, 7, 3, 9, 2.
When Richard was getting off on LSD for the first time, we were watching the water and the water was moving, and he started saying, we've got to draw the line somewhere. We've got to draw the line somewhere.
Honestly, that was kind of the story of Feynman and these three graces at Esalen. I think he was someone who truly was open-minded and open-hearted. He liked the human connection, I think, because he recognized its power.
Yeah. So Debbie and Cheryl, Barbara, thank you for your work. Good work. Yeah, and just that idea of the group, again, the power of the group being its own sort of promise of altered state. So we're winding down here, just a couple of more characters who need to be presenced. And of course, Terence McKenna is somebody who's so intimately connected with Esalen. He, speaking of the Esalen archives, there is probably 100 or 150 hours of Terence's profound disquisitions. Profound, maybe not the right word. It's serpentine. It's like I don't understand what he's saying, but I know that it's the most important thing that I've ever heard. And I don't know how this works. I'm picking up on something, but it's like it's osmotic, the knowledge. So I have a little clip of Terence that I want to play for you from the late 1980s at Esalen. And I chose it not totally at random, but kind of at random, because I feel like the way that you can listen to Terence McKenna, it's almost like the way you can listen to the Grateful Dead. If you're a Deadhead, it's like, yeah, I could listen to this 77 show, or I could listen to this 84 show, or 93, and you end up, you just pick something, and it's like there is wisdom there. And I'm sure for religious people that the Holy Bible serves that as well. But any page of Terence McKenna, I am open to listen to.
As recently as, let's say, 1830, people believed the Earth was 4,000 years old. That means people didn't know what was going on. They weren't even close. I think the problem is that we have too long ignored the possibility that reality is stranger than we can suppose. What the psychedelic experience is saying is that we have the means present at hand to completely explode this nonsensical fiction of certitude. Our role is not to understand, but to appreciate. We have an immense capacity for resonance with beauty. What we need to do is empower experience. Well, this is where the psychedelics come in.
Yes, that's what we need to do. We need to empower experience and stop trying to understand everything and just get into that mode of appreciation. Just another character that deserves a little bit of props here in this room, Rick Doblin. So Rick Doblin came to Esalen in the early 1980s as a humble drug dealer, and he was able to find his life's purpose there. He was a work scholar at Esalen, one of these programs. It's now called LEAP, which is it's a very cool program. You come and you take a class and you work for a month, and you get to meet sort of a consortium of people. So Rick did that in the early 1980s, and he became the assistant to Stan Grof. And while he was there, he decided he wanted to become a psychedelic therapist, a profession that did not exist yet. And this guy, with his ridiculous work ethic and ability to dream, has created MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And that is inching close to approval. This, unfortunately, this New York Times headline is like, oh, it's about a year old, something like that. So we've had some disappointment around that recently, but Doblin has been enormously instrumental, and he's a little bit like Joe Biden. He's never going to quit. He's never going to quit. This next video is just about to conclude this baby. And it's kind of a quotation from Erik Davis, who I spoke to a while ago about the importance of psychedelics at Esalen and its unique contribution to the field.
One of the things that is most important about Esalen's role in psychedelic history is it did serve as a focalizing point, as a point of experimentalism in the 60s. But more importantly, I think, is the way that it kept alive, not just psychedelic practice or psychedelic culture, but the way that it kept a certain element of psychedelic thinking alive.
So that is where I want to leave you. This is, by the way, the podcast. And on the podcast, I have about probably 15 to 20 deep dives into psychedelics and the sort of the modern take on psychedelic psychotherapy, especially. But that's the question that I want to explore when we come back. What is psychedelic thinking, and why is it important? Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Sam. So we're just going to take a 5-minute break. We're going to set up the stage differently. If you got to run to the bathroom, run to the bathroom. But this won't be too long here because we want to keep it rolling. So see you soon. All right, folks. I think we'll be starting soon. Hello, everyone in internet land. Sometimes we turn off the conversations, but we're not going to do it tonight because it's a special night. So yeah, again, I just thought Sam and I would have a little conversation here for a bit, and then open it up to questions. I have no doubt that there will be some interesting questions out there. What did I think about? What came up? One of the things is you talk about how, I think this is a really important point that needs to be like underscored, is especially at Esalen, how altered states is a larger basket, and that some of what we might not, you might look at something like Encounter and go, oh, it's like some kind of extreme therapy. But then we have this idea of therapy, and what's therapy? And it's like talking, maybe it's crying a little bit of emoting, but it's really more far out than that, and that, so I guess I'm wondering what you think about how useful altered states is as a category to talk about the whole project,
The whole project of
Esalen.
Yeah, I mean, people were engaging in altered states when they get a massage. There was Babatunde Olatunji, who was this Nigerian drummer and educator who brought all these people through dance and rhythm. Just walking on the land at Esalen is some form of altered state because it is removed. It's something different. So yeah, so far I haven't come up with anything that's not altered. There must be some boring things there.
Sure, some paper pushing and things. But I guess what it makes me think of is one of the things that happens in the 60s. I mean, you can take it back to the 1950s, and obviously all of it has, like you say, it all goes back. You can find origin stories, things that go back farther, but it's sort of a realization in the modern secular rational world that there's just all of these different altered states possibilities, and that they just have to, at some point or another, people are going to start exploring them and thinking about them. And they're not doing it under the guise of religion, because that's where you used to put them. You either put them in religion or psychosis.
Yes.
And sometimes at the same time. This is always funny, about the Great Awakenings in the 19th century, these mass revivals in upstate New York where people are rolling on the ground and they're seeing God, and they're coming to Jesus, and all these extraordinary experiences, which from one side look like this incredible revival of religious passion and religious formation in the United States. But there were other religious people at the time who didn't like that kind of Christianity, and they just said they were crazy. So like psychosis and craziness, to my mind, is always right next door to the other narratives that we might have about altered states. And so it's incredibly significant that Esalen was also a site, I was very happy to see you point out the whole anti-psychiatry sort of recovery of madness as its own kind of altered state, its own kind of transformative, even shamanic experience. That's what Silverman would think about as in fact, in those days, now we have a certain way that people talk about the shaman, right? Everybody knows what the shaman is and how the shaman functions in some idea of psychedelics and how psychedelics are operating. Back in the 50s and 60s, the shaman was crazy. That was how traditional societies handled madness. It's like, oh, that's what the shaman was able to go crazy and come out of it. So the shaman was actually a figure of psychosis. And part of what Silverman did in that, one of the fellows in that photograph, was he was like, let's actually look at what's actually going on here. Well, let's not think about it as psychosis. Let's think about it as some kind of derangement or some kind of altered state out of which something really productive actually happens for the society, for the individual. So it was a rereading of shamanism that partly created the sort of remodeling of psychosis as a potential transformative kind of altered state.
If I know correctly, the story in the 1980s, Dick Price was able to, with Stan Grof, was able to establish something called the Spiritual Emergency Network. And Debbie might know more about this, where they were able to view people having these mental breaks. And I guess there were people having mental breaks at Esalen during that time as sort of a spiritual emergence. And so they recontextualize it, and they had places off property where these folks could be brought, and they would have sitters with them, people who would sit with them for 24 hours and be pretty much just reflectors and not really invade, but keep them safe and all that. And it was a project that went on for years.
Well, it's interesting when you describe that. What does that sound like? Well, it sounds like trip sitting. And
Right.
and one of the arguments I wanted to make in my book High Weirdness, where I talk specifically about Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson and Philip K. Dick, who's less of a psychedelic figure, but Lilly's in there, and one of the kind of main things I'm trying to describe is that there are these forms of experience or modes of experience where you cannot resolve the difference between psychosis and religion and speculative fiction and mysticism. That they're thoroughly blended, and in a way, how we respond to them, how the integration happens, how the set and setting reflects that, is part of what makes the difference. But that it's really important to remember that, like, psychosis in the full sense is in the room. It doesn't mean it's leading the show. It doesn't mean that it's going to dominate the picture, but it's in the room on some level. And that was something about the Esalen's whole approach towards, and Dick Price's project in general, that I think was really one of the more innovative and also still challenging elements. Like, other aspects of the vision have been more sort of recuperated into wellness culture and even contemporary psychedelic culture, but that claim about madness, which is all around us, it's in our streets, it's in our families, it's in our lives, is still a really tough one and a fascinating one to wrangle with.
Yeah, I had heard that Dick Price was really a fan of people. He was not scared of people who were odd, and he was okay with people being there who were sort of against the grain. And he brought people there who didn't quite fit in. And of course, he was a close friend of Lilly.
Yeah.
And if you look at interviews from the end of Lilly's life, there are some very odd ones that are available on YouTube with Lilly. You know, he starts off as this person. He's like incredibly intelligent and articulate, and by the end of the 70s, he's wearing this coonskin cap, and he is you can't discern what he's saying really, and he's talking about these, you know, aliens that come and have cut off his penis in the night, you know, like things that are far out there.
Yeah,
that are out there.
That are definitely out there. And well, when you say that about the Dick Price not minding having odd people around, and that means that you're welcoming into your idea of community friction and even extreme friction. And that's part of what is so, in a way, different about that mode, about that time, is the willingness to take on intense friction and conflict and craziness and practices or situations that we would now associate strictly with trauma as something that is potentially liberating. And I like the way that you presented it, because it was much more clear, and you were very clear about saying, we can't do this now, for liability reasons, because we know it's traumatizing, because we know that people still have scars. This is no longer appropriate. But it helps us see that there was something different there, something that could happen, some of which was very productive and fascinating, but very costly in other ways. And I think a lot of it, and I just have to hear you reflect more on, like, how is there like a sort of smooth transition, or is there kind of like no, we got to keep some of that traumatizing stuff back there? Like, have we gone too far in in castigating all of these things as, well, that's traumatizing. It's like, well, a little trauma, can go a long way. It can break you, whatever. Like, I mean, it seems like glib to say, but in a way, if we look at the history of the altered states at Esalen, take it seriously that this was a transformative project, that there's something about trauma in the picture that is really difficult for our contemporary moment. So I'd just love to hear how you come to reflect on that.
Well, there's something that's deeply useful about confrontation. And I think that it was particularly useful in that era. You're reacting against a very kind of repressive era that folks were coming out of. And now we live in a time of postmodern, moment where everything has been discussed and exposed. And it's not the same in 2024 to get in a room with people and tell your 3 worst secrets and the 3 things you hate about them. It's not maybe as productive. And I think that there are programs at Esalen and in the sort of wider universe that Esalen may have influenced, that there's interactions like this that have been tempered, right? There, where people can be real, but at the same time, they're being real and supportive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
very much so. Very much so. One thing that I'd like to hear, because one of the first things that pop into people's heads about Esalen is massage, or the physical practices, the touch practices. How do you see the connection between the altered states paradigm that's being explored there, and the really important and influential development of massage and modes of touch?
Yeah, maybe that's a good example of something that can, that can be an altered state, but it's also incredibly safe, because the folks, and I think that it always was, although people, it used to be not only the person getting massage was nude, but also the practitioners were nude at Esalen for the 60s and 70s, and actually into the 1980s. And probably the only reason that the practitioners ended up being clothed in the 80s is that somebody came down from the county and they said, you're going to have to put clothes on, or you're going to have to get an entertainer's license. So nowadays, people wear whatever they wear. But yeah, I see people all the time wandering around the lodge, and they don't know how to open a door. And it's like, what happened to you? I was down at the baths and I got this transformational experience. It's sort of like the kinder, gentler element, I would say, of altered state that Esalen's able to provide, that is maybe more appropriate for like today's moment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
It's
not, it's sort of like, it's fun to talk about how fucked up and weird and experimental things were in the 60s, but you also, these days, you have to deal with blowback in a much more direct way. And I think that in some ways, it makes more sense to play it safe, or in the areas that you're not playing safe, those need to be intellectualized. They need to be subsumed into discussion rather than enacted through the body.
Yeah, very. I mean, no, violence is.
That's what CTR is like, that you're a part of, right? I imagine things get very edgy and odd and weird in there, but that's.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that brings me to the other question. I'd just like to hear you talk more about the element of the group. Like, I had never really thought, like, okay, the stuff they're doing in Encounter and whatever, like the actual elements of it have been around for decades. And if you think about psychoanalysis, what is psychoanalysis? It's like talking about your dreams. It's like talking about altered states, and then the situation in the room and the projection and the transference and the dreaming and all that is, so you're actually creating kind of a weird altered state in the room. So it's like altered states, and and there's a whole shadow side of analysts talking about telepathy and synchronicities, and that, like, they won't admit it publicly because they're supposed to be rationalists, but there's this whole lore of all this weird shit that's been happening. So it's been weird from the get-go, but the difference of bringing that into group, and what group does and what kind of community does there. And I don't know, I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about, like, what are the specific things, even just from your own experience of seeing, like, what can happen in group that can't happen in a dyad.
yeah, what can happen in group is that you're not just seen by your trusted therapist, somebody who you've been going to for a couple of years. You're being seen by somebody, by 6, 7, 8, 10 people that you met on Monday, right? And so there's this nervousness and excitement in the revelation of the self that is possible at Esalen that people are drawn to because it's scary.
Yeah.
And I think the project of the self has been the deepest project at Esalen. I don't know if Michael or Dick would have said that, but it's this sort of human potential project is, you can be more than you thought you were because you can discover. And through these practices that you're going to be introduced to, or by walking this land, or this discussion that you're going to get into at midnight while you're in the lodge, that will enable you to dig into this real version of the self. And to do it amongst community, unfortunately, is a unique experience in today's society. I mean, what I see here at the Alembic is, it's quite special. It doesn't exist in other areas in this way. There's probably a few. There's not a lot. And Esalen, too, is very unique and special, and feeling that sort of kindredness amongst folks, where there's an encouraging kind of aspect to step in deeper. And,
Yeah, the reason I asked about that, and this will be my last question, and we can open it up, is that, there's at this point of the game, there's a lot of criticism of the human potential movement and the sort of even at the time, the obsession with the self and kind of narcissism, and in a way, we're all too selfed at this point, and it's like, get me out of this fucking thing sometimes. But the reason I'm asking about the group thing is that really emphasizes something else that's going on here. Maybe not as strongly as it could be, maybe not as much now as it was then, maybe because it's difficult to come up with new formats that can play with group energy in a way that doesn't just completely turn the self on itself. You know what I mean? Like, there's something about the group dynamic and collective and how communities work. So how do you see that playing out now in terms of the way that groups and communities and interactions are happening, either in terms of the programming or in terms of the larger humanistic psychology thing, or in Esalen?
I think it's much the same as it was. And I like that skewering of the narcissism of the human potential movement, because I love Tom Wolfe. He's one of my favorite writers. So he wrote The Me Decade in the early 1970s, and it was very explicitly about Esalen. It was about some other things too, but I don't think that Wolfe was right. I don't think that it was narcissistic. Maybe I've been drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit too long, but I do think that the development of the self, sort of an investigation of the self, there's not much danger. What's the worst thing that could happen? Like a little bit of narcissism. So what? Because probably you're going to get a real understanding of self, particularly if you're gifted with a good therapist or a good therapeutic community. And yeah, there's that belly button gazing at Esalen. That's what pays the bills. And I think that's what draws people there. It's like that woman who in that video who said, I want them to applaud for me. Like, that's real. That doesn't get old. I think that's an honest impulse. And it's few and far between the opportunities that we have to stand up in front of a group and be known.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so we have Alana's got a mic out there, so if you have a question, so if people online can hear you. So the floor is open.
Well, I think that when we talk about altered states of consciousness, we first have to address what is a so-called normal state of consciousness. And it seems to me that leans so heavily on the conditioning that we all get. I mean, any society conditions its citizens to adapt to a certain view of reality, a certain acceptable way of behaving. And that is what is called reality and normalcy. And so anytime that there's an opportunity like Esalen affords to expand that and to allow one an opportunity to experience other realms that are not readily available otherwise. So what was happening in the 50s, I think, was very radical in the 60s when they had a departure from it. But of course, now things have progressed, thank goodness, so that it's much more common to have a wide variety of possibilities. And I think that we're very lucky to be living in this era. And I want to thank you for your contributions towards it. And I guess my question would be, where do you see the next frontier lying? I mean, you mentioned, Sam, that AI is something that calls to you or that you're involved in. I think that that will play a very pivotal role in what's going to be happening next. But that would be my question. Where do you see the next frontier?
You go. You
That's all, go for it,
You're going to go,
Eric,
man.
I'm not a good prognosticator.
Yeah,
I don't know.
So what about what you do a class on AI
Yes.
creativity? Why don't you give us, what do you do with
My
people?
spiel on AI? I know that it will not be popular, but there's so many horrible applications of AI. But I think that we need to be involved with it, because the work that we create today becomes, in some senses, like the data for tomorrow to train large language models or video programs or music programs. And if we can create positive work, then I think that it will end up creating a more positive outcome down the road. And just from an artistic perspective, I love to bring people into a creative state of mind using stuff like voice cloning and music production and video production and image production. And it's great if you have been a frustrated artist in some realm and you thought you would never illustrate, for example, a children's book, and then you realized I can illustrate, or I could prompt a children's book at least. And yeah, that's my challenge. I love to bring groups through from hatred to enjoyment. Yeah.
All right, that's good. Good.
Thank you so much. I used to work at a company that wasn't going to be evil, and now I do body work. I'm a much happier person. And I came here tonight to ask about massage at Esalen. I appreciate, thank you, Erik, for bringing up the massage as its own altered state. I do integration massage, which can create reactivation, but I also do massage with ketamine. And I'm curious about, within the history of Esalen and massage, have you come across any both ands where the massage is being supplemented, augmented, or in conjunction with substance?
You know, it has not been encouraged. Just as a general policy, it has been something that the massage team has been sort of instructed to discourage, because there's just an added element of unsafeness, I suppose, which is not to say that the work you do is unsafe, but it has to happen sort of, you know, in a realm where it's okay to do that. And so that has not yet been on the menu. I can see a lot of potential. I think that's a really cool, interesting endeavor. Yeah.
So I know there was some research being conducted at Esalen kind of from the beginning, but I don't know much about it. And I was wondering, do you know what, if any, data is available on some of these programs? Is there any sort of like experiments that were being run? Did we learn anything about whether experiencing these altered states like change anything about your life? And what's sort of the state of the research that was happening either at the time or now on this stuff? at Esalen?
Wow. No, I actually don't know about, research in general happening there around altered states, you're saying? Yeah. I'd love to learn more. Okay. Yeah. We'll figure it out together. Yeah.
I had a question for you. Do you know the story of Grof's development of holotropic breathwork, and how much did it have to do with being at Esalen and seeing other modalities that people were bringing to Esalen? And
it came from working with people who had been undergoing LSD, and he found that, and they were sort of out of the experience, and he found that by touch, he was able to bring them back, right? And he also found that by encouraging breathing, it was able to reactivate the experience. And then I don't know exactly how he just made the conceptual leap from, it can reactivate a psychedelic journey to it can activate a psychedelic journey without psychedelics. Yeah. But yeah, he was able to do that. Yeah,
I was just always wondering what other kind of breath work he was familiar with or had seen, Kundalini, Vastrika, and things like that are kind of overlap, similar. So I was just kind of curious if you knew more about that. Oh, thanks, Dave.
Dan's wife, Christina, was a student of Muktananda, and she had a spontaneous Kundalini arising. I believe the first one when she was giving birth. And she was very aware, of course, of pranayama, so I think she may have had an influence as well.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Debbie, while you have the microphone, I was curious to know, you had spoken to me, I think, about Spiritual Emergency Network.
Yeah, I think, Cheryl, you may have also been a volunteer, I think, and Barbara was as well. I was invited by Stan in 1981 to come down and do a 3-month internship, and our community service was to do the holonomic breath, first learn it and do it for the community, and also to help Rita Rowan, who was a fabulous massage therapist, queen of the massage world at Esalen at the time, to create a network throughout the world where there would be psychiatrists, therapists, spiritual healers, people who could support people going through a psychosis. And so we were, at the very beginning, we had a Rolodex, very high tech. And so that was my introduction. And I think, Cheryl, do you want to say more about it?
No, I would like to say something that I thought was really interesting about the Spiritual Emergence Network. I was in charge of it for a while, and most of the time, we would get a few calls a day, and it would mostly be people in crisis. But then a tiny little article came out in Omni magazine, and it just briefly described what the network was. And all of a sudden, the telephone would ring every 10 minutes. And it was these very intelligent, high-functioning people saying, "Oh, I never knew that such a network existed. I have never told this to a soul before. I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but let me tell you what happened to me." And so I was in the privileged position of hearing all of these untold stories and seeing how common and closeted all of these extraordinary experiences are. And so that was really a very privileged position for me to be in.
Wonderful.
Hello. Okay. Hi. I'm remembering your initial invitation to share how you feel.
Yes, great. Thank you, Alpert.
Before. And so I'm feeling happy that you're smiling and a little anxious. And it's nice to see faces that are friendly. And there's this feeling of, wow, there's a lot in the room, just in terms of history that you've brought kind of almost through this amazing sharing, and then history and people who I don't know, but imagine hold so much. So there's this strange feeling of like a current or a river. I have an image, right? And just honored to be a small part of that river as well. I guess my question is something like, because I loved the idea of psychedelic thinking and what is that? And I guess I have this, the inquiry that I have is like, how can we do that now? Right. And there's something about psychedelic experience where it's like, like feelings start to speak, or like strange, there's an interpenetration of things that don't normally belong together, right? There's like this strange conglomerate mixture. And I'm wondering if I can do that with you, right? If we can alembicide or whatever that might be, right? kind of conglomeratedly admix, right, at the being level. So, so I guess the question is, how can we do it here now, if it's possible?
Great question. Love that. Yeah, well, I want to hear more about what you had thought when you say psychedelic thinking. What was in your mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I realize that, and I've talked about that sometimes, but I usually don't spell it out exactly, and not to just be a dodge, but more that it's a, you know, we use the word thinking in a kind of casual way of just like whatever you're doing, you're rationally or anything. I'm thinking about something, I'm thinking of something, but inside like in a more like philosophical context, there's just sort of like saying the ordinary thoughts, and then there's really thinking. And it's sort of like, wait, like wait, you know, it's like actually going into the problem with an enthusiasm about articulation, about how symbols can work, about how memories can function, about how books and lines of poetry and this sort of cognitive material is part of the picture, but the actual work is not necessarily coherent. And by saying that, like Esalen kept psychedelic thinking going, is that even though there's all this emphasis on practice, there's still a kind of philosophical exploration going on there.
Yes.
And that's something that people are talking about now, about what is the, you know, how do we philosophically integrate psychedelic experiences? You know, not everybody has these, but a lot of people have ontological shocks. They come out going, what the, you know, and you can't put it back together. And sometimes that can be traumatizing. Sometimes it can be like, okay, I'm just going to put that under the curve. You know, I'm not going to think about that for a while. You know, or you think with it. Like an enigma, like a problem, like something you kind of keep. How could it be? Like, how do I deal with synchronicities? That's always, for me, that's my favorite one to bring up. You get a couple synchronicities, it's pretty cool, right? Usually, I mean, sometimes they can be creepy, but usually they're kind of funny or sweet. You know, get a couple, like, ooh, it all lined up, like there's some deeper element going on. You start getting them like that, you're fucking nuts. You're crazy. You're psychotic. And so what do I do with that? Whoa, like that's like, I can't finalize that problem. I can only kind of play with it, but I have to play with it cognitively, because synchronicities only work partly because we're thinking. It doesn't work as like a purely physical thing. It has to be, there's a symbolic, that word was like that word. I mean, there's like a layer of narrative or a layer of cognition that's going on in the staging. Otherwise, it doesn't really work. So to me, that's like a really good example of like psychedelic thinking is like thinking in and with synchronicity, but not necessarily swallowing the plot.
Yeah, I have a question about a historical question, because I'm always fascinated with the counterculture, and I've seen as I read about it, things rise and fall like Synanon or something like that, and it seems like Esalen has had a lot of continuity and has managed to hold itself together. And I'm curious about like, did you get a lot? Do you feel that there was a lot of pushback or infiltration? Ken Kesey's, I just, you know, was dealing with a lot of things. People like Leary when he went to Mexico, he had CIA people traveling around, and Gordon Wasson had a cameraman with him who was reporting back to the CIA, and all these crazy stories that you hear about the forces of control, like trying to grapple with this stuff and infiltrate this stuff. And did that ever come up in Esalen? And I'm curious how you managed to survive, how it managed to survive all this time.
Well, I think one reason why Esalen has been able to kind of continue where a lot of times the kind of the groups like a Synanon would fall would because Michael especially had been inoculated against cult. Like he went to the Sri Aurobindo ashram and he had a great time there, but he also realized that it was like everybody's doing what this one person said, right? And so he and Dick were really fervent when they established Esalen, that again, like no one would capture the flag and it wouldn't be this guru type of situation. And if you meet him, you know, you'll kind of get this sense that he's kind of just like a jovial guy who's really, really curious about things, right? And so he had that spirit, you know, about him that has kept the place, I don't know, I guess, in a safe place. But in terms of the drugs and CIA and everything like that, what I believe is true is that he met with the FDA. This is before the DEA existed, and it was in the late 60s, and met with the FDA, and they had a talking to, and it was agreed that you can't sanction drugs, you know, at your institution. People might end up doing them, but if they do them, they need to do them in sort of the privacy of their room and not in like a sanctioned way. And because he had that conversation with the FDA in an official way, nothing ever happened. That's as far as I know. I think it's probably, much.
Have you ever done any FOIAs, for example, on the?
That's a good question.
What's a FOIA?
The Freedom of Information Act, where you request CIA files.
Wow, that sounds like a good project.
Yeah, I was going to say we've just here, my good son. There's a rabbit hole that's calling for you.
Wow, that's good.
Great. First, thank you so much for the history and the exposition of Esalen. One thing that really struck me was the degree to which the institution was focused on different modalities of just the sort of the psychedelic experience. And I was wondering to what extent attention was given. There was a little bit of reference to music and to sound. And I asked that question. I happen to be a practitioner, been in the space about 25 years, facilitating individuals, groups. And in recent years, I've just found myself really drawn to utilizing sound much, much more. And I often say with many, we can get to these spaces in many ways. We can do it somatically, we can use breath work, we can use sound, we can use substances, but not necessarily. And sound is something in frequency modulation. My goodness, it's really been a big focus of my life. So to what extent was that playing a part? I mean, I saw George Harrison, wonderful, but was there more practitioners working with that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think music was intimately connected with Esalen, possibly because Esalen was intertwined in a certain sense with the counterculture. But drums in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I hear a lot about it from people who I speak with who were there in that 1980s. But drums were a big part of Esalen at that time, and people falling into the rhythm, right? And Babatunde Olatunji, as I said, was a big part of Esalen, and he was brought there initially by Gabrielle Roth, who developed five rhythms work at Esalen in the 80s. Roth is interesting because she was a massage therapist in the 60s, and in the 70s she wasn't yet doing the dance work. She was doing theater work. So people were doing emotive practice and doing a lot of, it's almost encountery. People like speaking, stamping, angry, but in this sort of embodied theatrical, type of thing. And then only into the 1980s was she using dance work and rhythm and sound to get people in that, I don't know what to call it. It's like a psychological, somatic space. But and Roth was not really a fan of psychedelics. When she was originally came to Esalen in the 60s, she was taking acid and smoking cigarettes and things like that. But she eventually found that the way into that state was through body and dance and rhythm. And yeah, but that's a great question about sound. And there's cool stuff that's happening now with like crystal singing bowls and probably musicians that you've never heard of, you know, just random awesome folk people. And as well in this celebration that's coming up in a week or so, Summer Groove, there's going to be the artist Nala Sinefro will be there, Earth Tones, DJ, Secular Sabbath, this cool kind of wacky group from Los Angeles will be there, and Becky Stark of Lavender Diamond. So it's just, I feel like Esalen is a place that musicians just are drawn to, and people want to experience sound there and just leave, you know, normal reality for a moment. So I think that's a cool point. Yeah.
My name is Gloria, and I am feeling psychedelic. By that, I'm going to say I really loved your invitation and question about what is psychedelic and can we experience it here now together, right? Because that's the invitation of every group experience. And so I want to kind of pick up where he left off, because when you were talking about psychedelic thinking as somehow like really thinking and noticing all the synchronicities, and I think that is one of the true gifts of psychedelic experience, is that the boundaries of what we think normal thinking, normal state, is habitual, right? Repetition of conditioning for known problems. So it's kind of very repetitive and rote. Whereas the psychedelic thinking is when the boundaries of what known thought is starts disintegrating enough that we have novel thoughts. We're at the frontier, right? That is the frontier of our reality. And also doing it in group is when we realize, oh yeah, it's connecting. And then there's a synergy of like other minds. So there's a mind melding that is more like visceral and somatic. It's all over the place. We feel it, right? That is like, for me, psychedelic thinking, which is really not just mental rote repetition of known before, but the actual frontier of what's possible with the actual people in the room. Right. And I think that's what Esalen, we've only gone once, but you know, it's super just amazing and all that levels. But I actually do have a question. So stop thinking, or stop talking. Right? So my question actually is, when you're doing this kind of presentation, you know, you have a presentation, what is it that you're wanting to like offer and experience for yourself? I mean, this is a precious hour of your life, maybe 3, 4, right? And I feel like once I turned a certain age, I'm like, everything is going to be my biggest offering every moment, right? And experiencing it to the like a juice of life. And now we have this 19-year-old son. And I was like, I think this is exactly what you want to be doing today. Of course it is. You know, we haven't seen you since your first year of college, and this is it. And so, you know, I'm wondering, like, he came here because I kind of, you know, said this is what we're doing. But I'm also wondering, like, when you're at this table, you know, you brought this to us. What is it for you?
I mean, my interest is I love like archival stuff. I love digging in the crates and adding specificity to and color to a conversation that can be kind of hazy. So I like arcane stuff, you know, and digging, whether that's finding the Dolphin House documentary on YouTube. I mean, that wasn't like the best dig of my life or anything, but yeah, finding something that's kind of that like a hidden, like when you're on that psychedelic journey and you find that like jewel right at the end, like that's exciting for me, and offering some sort of cohesion. Also, I wanted to put in my 2 cents about what I think psychedelic thinking is. And there's just, I'll add, because obviously it's this sort of like multifaceted thing, but I like the concept, and it's a little bit, it shares some qualities with postmodernism in that it's just a recognition of the multiplicity of truth, right? There's this thing, there's this thing, they seem seemingly opposite, both are actually true, and that's sort of, you know, fascinating to me.
Well, on the tip about your love of archives, which I share, there's always often this question, like, what's the point of history? And for me, there's something really important about institutional memory. And so what I wanted to ask you, because I've had the experience of going to Esalen and having conversations and encountering people where I feel like I'm tapping in to the currents, the historical currents that run through the place.
Yeah.
And I've had the experience of going there and being frankly shocked at how little, not just guests, but some of the teachers and some of the staff get, like, at all. And I'm like, what? Because if there isn't any institutional memory, then it's not Esalen anymore. It's just a name. It's just a wellness retreat place that has cool events.
Right.
So as someone who's carrying that material, how do you think about your role and how important that is, and what the support is, or whether you have concerns, or just how you think about that, maintaining that?
It's a people's history of Esalen. You know, it's so many people have gone through, thousands of people. Who knows how many? I don't know how many teachers have been there. And so for every like dip into that catalog where you find this wacky ass class on divorce as a creative act, or or marathon encounter, 48 hours of hell, you know, that's historical. And as you say, that's institutional memory, that it's like, this place is actually more interesting than you thought it was. It's more, you know, and gosh, I wish there was more documentary footage that I could page through. There's not a lot. And some of my challenges in the archives is realizing, God, I know that the archives is probably, the Esalen archives is in the diaspora.
Yeah.
You know, there's stuff that's on Super 8, Super 16, on slides. There's these slides carousels in somebody's damn house in Marin, you know, that I wish I could be there. And who knows, someday.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. First, I'll just offer deep gratitude to all the thinkers and thought leaders and experimenters who brought us to this moment and make these conversations so potent and powerful. I'll just make a quick joke. I think about the pricing at Esalen's definitely changed a lot over the years. And to just comment sort of socially about, you know, these people who are coming from Stanford and these high level places in society. And it's sort of like, regardless of what life path they chose, they weren't going to fall below a certain echelon in culture. Yes. Just to note that. And I'm coming tonight from Haight-Ashbury to this beautiful place, and we're having these wonderful sort of psychedelic conversations. But, you know, on that drive home, there's the tent cities and people who are sort of on that psychedelic edge. And I think there's a big difference between sitting in front of Alan Watts and hearing him, you know, emote such potently, and then seeing that like third, fourth generation on TikTok, the same quotes. And there's something that's like lost in that. And I don't think the need for like human transcendence is lost, but how do we stay closest to that like really potent transmission, and we're not like just feeding ourselves this candy of like recursive
yes,
if you get kind of where I'm going with that question. Thank you.
Yeah, I loved everything that you're saying, and I think that the secret is in producing yourself. You know, like that's deeply interesting, and I think there's something magical about that process of speaking. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like I hear this like house track, and there's Alan Watts speaking something, and it's like this can't, you know, this can't be coincidence. This is like the 5th time I've heard it this month, like a different Alan Watts quote. Why did people decide that Alan Watts like had so much connection to house music? it's odd. But I don't know. I think that question probably deserves a deeper response. What have you got there?
I don't know about deeper, but it's just another one. It's just, I think it's important to recognize that we're in a historical moment in the development of media where that particular question about iteration is just pervasive. So it's not like, oh, back then they had their own version of getting stuck in things, and then there was this fresh moment when Alan Watts could really talk to you. And now how do we make sure we have that moment? It's like we actually, we're in a different situation, and that anxiety and concern and even you know, the challenge of recognizing material that you think of as being really important and visionary and significant and illuminating, watching it be recirculated in a way that seemingly depletes it or undermines its function, and it happens faster and faster in smaller and smaller bites. Like that's actually like happening. It's not just like, oh, well, we can just da, 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 da. So I don't have a solution for it. I mean, this is not a really proper answer, because a lot of people kind of have to live there. But I'm sort of noticing that the people who sort of get most concerned about that problem spend more and more time in it. So I'm like, this may be like a point where we all get to make a decision about how much we really are going to spend time in that zone, in all the various features of it. Obviously, we can't avoid most of it, and some of it we got to look totally into, like AI. If we're going to take your attitude, we got to like plunge right into it. And in a way, that's the extreme hyperactive example of what we're talking about, because it's all just repeated. It's all dead. It's all just reformulated dead echoes, but it's just done in this incredible way. So we're kind of in this very weird place where it's not really clear what novelty is anymore. And I think it is really important to be in the body, emphasize face-to-face, experiences, hang out with animals, hang out outside, like kind of the basics. But like there's a sort of more desperate urgency to them to me now, because if you don't do that, I don't see it's very difficult not to just become recirculated in this weird way where you don't even know where you are anymore.
Well, I was going to say something else, but just to hop on that, Erik, like I work at Esalen, I'm Sam's colleague, and what I hear from our guests and our supporters is, especially post-pandemic, this thing of rather than navel gazing, this opportunity to connect with people. Yeah. Like, I don't know if it's an altered state now to get off your phone and actually put it away during the thing and sit around a table with other people that you don't know and bust your dishes together and say thank you to the person who's handling them for you. Some of that stuff is what's surfacing when I hear from our people who are coming now and enjoying just like reconnection and the embodiment piece, just to like live from the neck down, having a massage and just feeling human again. Like these are becoming our altered states now, just like getting back with people and the body. So, but what I really wanted to say is how proud I am and grateful I am to Sam, because I want to presence this, to use the Samism, that Sam is really our history holder right now. And this is not something that he's been assigned to do. This is something that I believe Voices of Esalen was Sam's concept that he brought forward. We have over 1 million subscribers and listeners across the world now. And he's, Esalen is still wild in its way and roiling, and even the paper pushing gets a little nutty sometimes. We're very hard to manage. And so I don't know how it looks like from the outside, but it's still a wild place. And to have someone who's taken upon it himself to carry this part forward and to keep telling our story and to keep tracking down Super 8 footage and doing things like tonight. I just thank you, Sam, for what you're doing. It means a lot to us.
You.
Well, I think any burning. All right, you got a question? I think we're probably going to wind up soon.
Wait, we had a question here.
Okay. Yeah, well, we'll do those too.
Hi, my name is Renea, and it's the second time that I come to this space, and I feel really great. Thank you, and I loved your stories. I'm, we're like thinking this is history institutional. And I know that Esalen is the name of the indigenous people from there. And I just wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about, I saw at the library in San Francisco a movie about the Esalen people are making, they're trying to bring back and have a resurgence of their groups. And so how does Esalen Institution, mix with all that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was a cool land acknowledgement that I was able to attend. I think it was about a year ago when the Esalen tribe of Monterey County came to Esalen and was just sort of acknowledged formally in a way that felt healthy and helpful. Yeah, it's kind of it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. And it almost makes me think a little bit about like the talk that I've put forward, which is like 90% white men. It's like white man after white man after white man after white man, and it's not a coincidence, and it's a little bit like what you were saying about these guys from Stanford who made their mark on the world, and then they were able to be bold and wild and free and white and privileged, where they were set up for success, in certain ways. And yeah, the Esalen tribe of Monterey County is kind of, we're in a good place, I think, now with them, after there's been times when there's been separation, I think, and there's an active conversation now, and there's a lot of presence on the Esalen campus, with Esalen tribe. And yeah, there's always room, I think, for more dialogue and more conversation. But I can say that the folks who are running Esalen and the Murphy family as well are very interested in the best possible dialogue with Esalen.
Piggybacking on the last few comments and questions, we feel very fortunate, those of us that have lived through the 60s and 70s, and that time was so exhilarating and different than how we experienced this time. And during that time in the 70s, there were 300 or more growth centers like Esalen.
Mm-hmm.
Esalen survived, and a handful of others in New York and Massachusetts and so on, but they died. And God, do we need them now?
Yeah.
And so I was wondering what your thoughts were about either a resurgence or a growth of growth centers like Esalen, or how that is. I'm not asking you to predict the future, just how could it be that when we need this in some ways more than ever during these times, how could we approach it?
Yeah. My goodness. Well, there's just so much luck, I think, involved in an institution staying alive for 60 plus years. I mean, if you just follow the weather reports for the last 5 years, you just see all the times the road has gone out, all the times that fires have come to Big Sur and have just stopped kind of like at the doorstep of Esalen. Yeah, there is maybe almost a certain kind of magic, not to get too woo, just a little bit
Go
woo.
ahead, it's okay.
All right. Maybe a little type of magic that's surrounding the place. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I feel, I'm not trying to set up Esalen as like savior of the United States or anything like that, but I do think that sort of like navel gazing in group, the unfolding of the self, revelation of the self, the applaud from me, that's fucking medicine that people are severely lacking. And when they lack that, they lash out and they call trans kids the problem. They call immigrants the problem. They call whoever, and if it was up to me, yeah, there would be a massive proliferation of not only growth centers, but God, just psychotherapeutic help, like some time for people to talk. And if, in conjunction with that therapy, possibly some MDMA assisted psychotherapy and some good music to go along with it.
All right, man, you got a whole protocol going there. That's pretty great. Well, as a representative of a place that's trying to do some version of that growth thing, which is actually kind of hard. There are reasons that there aren't as many of them, and my big influence was also the New York Open Center, which was a little headier, but only a little bit. And I'm so used to that as like the model where it's like pluralistic, there's mind and body and weird history and somatic. It's just like, of course that's what you want, and some traditions, and then weird new psychological ideas that don't have a traditional basis. And whatever. And I'm just sort of used to that. Like, that's kind of what I, hope we're moving slowly, slowly but surely towards that kind of pluralism, which I think is also really, really helpful, as opposed to like a meditation center that has one main teaching and one sort of set of teachers. And that can be really great and really powerful, but it inevitably becomes religion. And I'm interested in that like non-religious pluralistic space that goes into all of these realms of synchronicity and magic and wonder and ecstasy and terror and all that, that's really, really exciting to me. So I'm so glad. I feel really connected to you and to the presentation and your own archival interests, and how there is a role for this kind of historical memory inside of these, wacky worlds of far out experience. So, and thank you all for coming, and we'll be hanging out.
Thank you so much.